Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. I appreciate it. Can I follow up then? Because this was a similar line of questioning that I had as well with respect to secondary sanctions. So what do, and this is, I'm going to pose to both of you, what do you both understand to be the Trump administration's strategy to halt North Korea's missile program and the role that those secondary sanctions should play?
I can't speak, Senator, to the Trump administration's strategy here. Obviously, I'm now on the outside and am not a part of those discussions. I was a part of the last two administrations' discussions on North Korea, and typically there's a focus on how do we turn the pressure up to a level where North Korea is forced to the table in a way that they haven't yet been to date to engage in multilateral negotiations over their nuclear program. That's obviously
and part
a
of
very
that is
tall
making
order.
sure we, like you said, completely staff up the State Department and putting that pressure on through diplomatic channels. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely right. And it was essential in the Iran context. There's a lot of attention that's given to the work of our former office, the Treasury Department, the intelligence agencies, in terms of getting really effective, crippling sanctions in place on Iran. And what's sometimes neglected is how much diplomatic outreach was needed to make those sanctions work and to make them stick. That was hundreds of thousands of hours of visits to different capitals, everywhere from Azerbaijan to Singapore, to ensure that bankers, traders, and regulators were enforcing the sanctions in a tough, meaningful way. And it was a huge effort that requires diplomacy.
Okay. Mr. Sarati?
Senator, obviously I'm not part of the administration, but I think you can divine two core themes and changes in the Trump administration policy in North Korea. The first is a sense of urgency with respect to this issue. You've heard Director Pompeo from the CIA talk about this. This is now an urgent, direct problem that's being treated as a front burner national security issue, which is adding diplomatic attention and urgency to the issue. The second is placing the onus squarely on China to try to resolve these issues. Even the president's tweets have been, I think, an attempt to do that in perhaps a clever way. But in any event, I think the overarching theme is, can you persuade China in a cooperative way to influence North Korea in a way that they haven't to date? And I think that's the overarching thematic change. How they go about doing that, whether or not secondary sanctions should be a part of it, I think is yet to be seen. I haven't seen an articulation of this from the administration. Where I would agree with Adam, but then also disagree, is there's no question this has to be part of an overarching strategy. It has to fit into a strategy. We have to understand what we're trying to achieve with the financial and economic measures and use the full complement of them and choreograph them properly. Where I perhaps disagree slightly is I do think this is a moment to actually have the secondary sanctions in place, not to necessarily apply them, but to have the authority available, both to signal to the marketplace that this is a potential risk of doing business directly or indirectly with North Korean entities, and also to begin a signaling mechanism, a financial diplomatic message to Beijing that we are upping the ante, that this is a more urgent, a more serious dimension of how we're going to do this. This isn't going to be how we've treated the Chinese dimension of North Korea in the past. And so I think at a minimum, as a signaling mechanism, it's incredibly powerful. And it begins to open the aperture for diplomacy, for discussions with the private sector, for targeting of actors. And we see over and over again, the Wall Street Journal just this past weekend revealing ties between known Chinese entities with a presence in the U.S. and North Korean agents and networks. Those are the kinds of things that will be accelerated and exposed if you have secondary sanctions plus other measures in place.
And following up on that, and I just have a minute left, but as we talk about secondary sanctions, do you see a difference between applying that pressure on smaller Chinese banks versus the larger Chinese financial institutions, and what implications that means for our financial market?
I think secondary sanctions applied to the Chinese banking system is very difficult for three reasons, and Adam lays this out very neatly in his testimony. But I think the first is the Chinese learned a lesson after 2005 when we applied the Section 311 authorities against Banco Delta Asia, where the major Chinese banks, to include Bank of China, had exposure to North Korea. And so after that lesson, they realized it was probably not a good idea for the four major banks in particular to have exposure to North Korea. And so what you've seen since then has been a concentration of the kind of financial and commercial activity with North Korea, especially in the northeastern part of the country, concentrated with smaller institutions, smaller brokers, money service businesses, in a way that has isolated that activity from the major banks. That means then there's less connectivity to the U.S., and secondary sanctions are most helpful when there are entities being targeted that want access to U.S. markets or facilities. The fact that that is the case, though, doesn't undermine the credibility and strength of the potential secondary sanctions for two reasons. One is you have unknown connections to North Korea still. And even these institutions, these big four Chinese banks, may not understand or may not even see the exposure that they have to elements of the North Korean network. So that's one issue. The second is secondary sanctions can apply not just to banks, but to other commercial actors. And at a time when China is very much trying to expand the reach of its banks, I just got back from the Southern Cone, where you see the big towers of the Chinese banks in places like Buenos Aires and Santiago, Chile. And they're worried about their commercial brands around the world, Huawei and others. The reputational risk attached to what North Korea represents across the board is quite significant. And I think, maybe if I can leave you with this one thought, we have consistently underestimated the power of these tools, leveraged properly and appropriately with diplomacy and strategy. But I think we have to test and probe whether or not these tools can be used in a more aggressive form to change the Chinese calculus, because I actually think we can. And I think if it's done well and smartly, we can change the dynamics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.